pull up the slides. So give me about like 10 seconds or so.
Welcome everyone and good afternoon. My name is Camila Pollard and I am a Dean's Brand Ambassador at the UC Riverside School of Public Policy. I will be serving as your MC for today's Student Spotlight Seminar on the future of global finance, policy, and ethical implications of cryptocurrency and digital assets. This event is brought to you by the UCR School of Public Policy and its Dean's Brand Ambassadors. My peers and I are delighted to provide this service to the general community who are joining us in person and on Zoom as well. Before we get started, I want to first go over the format for today's seminar. We will devote the first 40 minutes to a presentation by our guest speaker. We will then reserve the remainder of the time for audience Q&A. Now at this point, I am pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Joshua Deese. Joshua is the principal lobbyist and founder at Deese and Associates, a progressive public affairs firm where he lobbies members of Congress as well as the Congressional Blockchain Caucus and other federal cabinet level regulatory agencies, including the U.S. Department of Treasury, Internal Revenue Service, and the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. His work pertains to advocating for legislation and policies regarding cryptocurrency rights, digital assets, and the advancement of blockchain technologies on behalf of decentralized finance projects in the crypto space. Moreover, he works to educate lawmakers in this nascent policy area. Joshua had the unique opportunity of interning for the U.S. Representative David Loebsack, I'm sorry, is that how I pronounce it? Loebsack? In his Washington, D.C. office and continued working in and around Capitol Hill through a variety of lobby days and congressional committee meetings with a variety of nonprofit organizations, including human rights campaigns. Further, Joshua also served as a national spokesperson for the Trevor Project and was a member of both the Youth Advisory Council and D.C. Ambassador Council, where he traveled the nation to speak on safer schools, anti-bullying, and suicide prevention legislation for LGBTQ youth to community leaders, state and federal legislators, and other important stakeholders. Joshua, we're so delighted to have you here with us today. I'll now hand it over to you for your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joshua Deese. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to come out today. I'm sure you all have busy schedules as the quarter's wrapping up. I'm pretty excited about cryptocurrency and blockchain technology, and you've probably heard a lot of hype around different altcoins and people getting rich. This presentation won't be that type of conversation. We're going to be talking about where finance has taken us, where we are now, and the exciting new steps taking us forward. And I think it's very important for us as future policy leaders and decision makers to know and be more competent in this new and exciting technology. So I'll talk about first how I got involved in cryptocurrency and blockchain lobbying. When I went to high school 2008 to 2012, and that was the very, very beginning of Bitcoin. And I remember reading about it on my laptop at night, and it was very, very cheap, and I wanted to buy it, but I wasn't 18, I didn't have a credit card, and my parents didn't want me to buy funny money. So unfortunately, that ship sailed and passed. So a few years after that, I started getting into cryptocurrency as an investor, just buying different coins, getting into Ethereum, into the Ethereum ecosystem. But it wasn't until a few years ago, well, yeah, with the whole AMC GameStop event that happened, where I started realizing, putting together how centralized finance, I mean, we all know that centralized finance isn't necessarily our friend, and they really bared their teeth and showed how ruthless they can be to prevent people like us, normal people, from making money and having a better life and prosperity. So part of my work, I lived and worked in the Washington, D.C. area for 5 years and did some lobbying for different types of nonprofit organizations. And that's how I got my political advocacy skills. So where I actually got started with my lobbying here is I was at a bar with some friends. This was last year. And I'm doing what normal people do at a bar. I was reading political articles on my phone. And I come across this article on the front page saying, there's this bill that is going to just unfairly regulate crypto, all of a sudden they're going to tax it. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but essentially someone had shoehorned some really, really bad policy into the infrastructure bill, which it was 2,700 pages long, and they shoehorned this tiny, tiny paragraph to try to tax crypto unfairly. So I'm sitting there at the bar and I'm literally saying to myself, I have to do something. So later that month, I registered federally as a lobbyist, and I started my LLC. And now, since then, since August of last year, we've been going to Capitol Hill, meeting with members of Congress and the blockchain caucus, as well as other federal regulators. So to understand what cryptocurrency is and how blockchain technology relates to this, we have to take a trip first and understand the history of money and how we got to this point. So when we started out economically in our more primitive state, primitive civilization, we mainly had bartering economies where we would trade goods and services for other goods and services. Say I needed milk, you could trade some wheat in exchange. But bartering has issues. Sometimes the things that you're trying to exchange, the other party doesn't want, isn't interested in, or there isn't a way of dividing it. Say you're looking for some wheat and your neighbor is trying to exchange a cow. Like, how can you divide a cow to equal the amount of wheat that you have? It's messy, it's just all over the place. So we invented money as a medium of exchange in order to have a more accurate representation of the value of the things that we exchange, goods and services. Moreover, money can also be used as a store of value as well. And that's where things can be bought in the future with higher utility, like stock market gains. So we can take a look at what money is, or what is money, and that can be classified into 4 different parts. Those 4 parts are durability, portability, divisibility, and scarcity. So durability, any item that's used as money has to be durable. That's why we use typically coins these days, because they last for a pretty long time. Whereas perishable items like bananas or coconuts don't necessarily, they lose their value when they spoil. So we can't necessarily use those as currencies. And even in early societies, they realized the impact that metal and other substances that were a bit more formidable had on an economy. Secondly, with portability, money has to be easily moved around. So large and bulky items like gold bars can present a problem because they can't be transported easily. Another part is the divisibility of the money that you're using. So money has to be capable of being divided into smaller parts. And divisible money helps make transactions of all sizes and amounts possible. So for example, here in the US, we use the US dollar, and that's the main currency. That can be broken into smaller parts, which we call cents. Whereas Bitcoin is the main currency, and that can be broken into smaller parts called Satoshis. So Satoshis are the cents of Bitcoin. And the last classification of money is scarcity. Money should be scarce enough to have some value, but not so scarce that it's unavailable. Pebbles and animal teeth, conch shells, seashells were used for a time, but other explorers and foreigners, people come from outside areas could come in with large swaths of seashells and completely flood the market and just destabilize the economy. So the idea of scarcity was important in terms of creating an economy that it can be sustained. So when we look at the actual functions of money, I mentioned earlier the medium of exchange and a store of value. There's also a standard of value as well. So using a variety of items as money would be confusing. So societies have developed uniform monetary systems where they can measure the value of goods and services more accurately. And for money to be acceptable, it has to function as a medium of exchange, as a standard of value, or as a store of value. So as a medium of exchange, money makes transactions easier. And that's because when you have a common form of payment, it's much less complicated than having a barter system where goods and services are exchanged for other goods and services. So money allows the exchange to be a very simple process. So money also serves as a standard of value. And with a form of money whose value is accepted by all, goods and services can be priced in standard units. So again, like dollars and cents. This makes it easy to understand the value of products, and it also allows transactions to be recorded in consistent terms. And finally, as a store of value, money is used to hold wealth, which you see a lot with investments in the stock market. It retains value over time, although it might lose value due to inflation or other financial events. But individuals can choose to keep their money for future use rather than exchanging it today. So here in the United States, we had a period of time where it was called the bimetallic era. And this is between 1834 and 1900 when the US operated off of gold and silver. So they backed the value of their currency off of those two metals. And in 1834, Congress had fixed the price of gold to $20.67 per ounce, and it stayed there until 1933. 1900 comes around and we kind of separate from silver and we start relying solely on gold, and that's where we enter into the gold standard. But as a result of World War I, the gold standard began to disintegrate, and that was because major world powers were resorting to inflationary finance. And the gold exchange standard was reinstated from 1925 to 1931, but it wasn't until 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt nationalized the gold owned by private citizens and did away with contracts in which payments were specified for gold. So he was basically saying that your private gold is now the property of the US government. So when we're looking at fiat currencies, which is essentially money that's not backed by a commodity like gold or silver, it is printed, owned, and managed by a state or a central bank, and it's designated legal tender by a government. So essentially just paper money. So paper money is much more portable than metals. It's cheaper to transport as well. And the US was backed by the gold standard, like I mentioned before, where a $10 bill is equal to a $10 gold coin. Between 1946 and 1971, countries operated under the Bretton Woods system following World War II, and that used a fixed currency exchange rate to use gold as a universal standard. And that also created the International Monetary Fund as well as the World Bank. So because persistent US balance of payment deficits were reducing the US gold reserve, it started to reduce the confidence in the ability of the US to redeem its currency in gold. And it was on August 15th, 1971, where President Nixon announced that the US would no longer redeem currency for gold, and that was essentially the end of the gold standard. So we can take a look at why the gold standard itself failed. So American banks essentially printed more money than they had in gold. And when enough people tried to cash out the gold, the banks could not service the customers. So there was a very high risk for bank runs and collapses because they just couldn't keep up with the demand. So essentially, the US had committed a fraud by printing more receipts for gold than there actually was, and that's why Nixon ended it. So had Nixon not taken the US dollar off of the gold standard, a global economic collapse would have likely resulted. And because of the major power that the US had at the time, other nations didn't really fight back. They didn't say, oh, no, we're going to stick with gold standard. They followed along and went for the fiat standard. So because governments print the money themselves, and it's essentially illegal for other people to make their own money, it's considered counterfeiting or fraud or forgery, they're the only ones who can do so through a central bank and their monetary policy. So they essentially create an unethical monopoly. And since the end of the gold standard in 1971, we've seen increases in public debt and income inequality, as well as currency crashes and inflation. And they all happened right after 1971. It's no coincidence. So taking a look at the problem with centralized finance today, the fractional reserve banking works like this. So governments and a central bank essentially give banks a license to cheat, and that they're able to hand out more money than they actually have within their stores or within other assets they might have. So when people perform bank runs and they want their cash, like we saw in the 2008 financial crisis, the banks fail and then they ultimately get bailed out by the government by printing even more money, which creates more inflation. So this is a very unfair advantage, and it's one of capitalism's most pressing criticisms. It's also known as crony capitalism. Bankers typically take high risks and they privatize gains while socializing the losses, which is why we saw so many people become homeless as a result of the financial crisis. So when you look here on this graphic, the bank on the left is a central bank, and the green check marks represent the banks that actually have the money there whenever they're doing the transactions. The two X's represent two failed banks that didn't have the money to actually give out. So the money under the bank on the left is what the government is printing to bail out the banks that, to essentially replace their coffers, replenish them rather. And this translates also to the Cantillon effect, which this describes the uneven effect that inflation has on goods and assets in an economy. So essentially, the central bank will print new money, and that moves over to private banks. Those private banks take advantage of that money because inflation hasn't started yet. And they know that because the money has been printed and they've received it, that inflation is going to happen. So they get their goods and services and assets at a heavy discount. Then that gets transferred over to private firms and companies, CEOs. They get higher market caps, which means that the values of their companies go up as well as inflation. And then that gets transferred over to people like us, the consumers, regular people. What we get out of that deal is higher prices in our consumer spending as a result of the inflation, like we're seeing today. And it's also important to note that the Cantillon effect is an accelerator of income inequality. It primarily benefits the wealthy. It takes funds from the middle and the working classes. It's a bottom to top redistribution of the wealth. It's essentially creating a tax on consumers. And these are people who don't have a decision or say in the financial or monetary policies that affect them. So we can try to talk and think about different solutions. And while I don't agree with everything Friedrich Hayek says, he made a very good point in 1981. He was talking about how for the past 200 years, governments have said that we can't experiment with money, we can't improve upon it, we can't create our own new forms, it's like it's hands off. Only the government can do it. That's our turf. You can't touch it. So we essentially remain in a fiat currency state. So he said that, quote, there are mostly abuses of money, and I have come to the position of asking, has monetary policy ever done any good? I think it has only done harm, and that's why I'm now pleading for the denationalization of money. All we can do is by some sly roundabout way, introduce something that they can't stop. Enter cryptocurrency. So before we get into what cryptocurrency is, we have to look at the underlying technology that it's based on, and that is the blockchain. The blockchain is a distributed ledger, which is used for storing transaction data. If a blockchain is sufficiently decentralized and Turing complete, which is a more technical term of talking about how it's cryptographically secure, it's essentially and effectively a global supercomputer, and that allows any individual to access it, and there's no person or organization that can control it. So when I'll talk about a few terms in regards to blockchain and the anatomy of it, because there are two different types of blockchains. You have your private and your public ones. Public blockchains allow anyone to set up a node, which is another word for a computer, to take part in the upkeep and maintenance of the network. And that includes most cryptocurrencies that are on exchanges. And then to take part in a private blockchain, you have to be invited by the people who have created it. So when we're looking at the anatomy of the blockchain, there are new layers, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that a little bit further when it comes to the new layers of the internet where all this fits in. But there are 4 layers within the blockchain: the infrastructure, network, protocol, and application layers. So the infrastructure layer essentially determines whether a chain is centralized, distributed, or decentralized. The network layer relates to how data moves across the network. The protocol relates to how people participate and reach consensus in a network. And the application layer is where apps and services can be built on a chain. For the most part, most of us will be using the application layer, unless you are a coder or programmer, then you'll be using the other 3. For the most part, consumers use the application layer. So some of the benefits of blockchain include decentralization, like decentralized apps, which I mentioned earlier, decentralized finance, which is the ability to create an alternative economic system which moves away and stops the dependency on centralized finance, as well as digital collectibles. We've talked about NFTs. The court is still out on that one, but when you're looking at how the government is trying to define what a cryptocurrency is, some people within the government would say that cryptocurrency is a new form of virtual property. So it would be treated as property. So digital collectibles could fall under that territory legally. There's also play to earn gaming applications, which I think are pretty cool in that, say in video games today, you've heard of DLC, downloadable content, where you get charged to buy skins and costumes and upgrades, and all of that money goes to the gaming company. Whereas, say in the metaverse, where you have an open source game, say you're in this open world and there's a beach, you can set up a bike shop and you can design your own little bikes that people can buy with in-game currency or Bitcoin or Ethereum or what have you, and you get that money instead. It doesn't go to the company. You made it, so it goes to you, and then you have actual Bitcoin or in-game currency, which you can convert into other funds, which you can actually use. So there are many use cases and utilities of blockchain. One of the main ones is transaction validation through the blockchain. The blockchain is immutable in that it's very hard, nearly impossible, but it could happen, but very hard to manipulate. Or if someone was to create like a false block on the chain because there's so many other computers trying to verify it at the same time, it would only take just a few minutes before people were like, no, there's something wrong here because the 50 of us have this one answer and you're wrong. So development of technology is also important. Like looking at supply chain management, for example, instead of, we're humans, we make mistakes, and there's lots of human error, especially when we're moving exports and imports. So having a blockchain that is unbiased and doesn't make mistakes, it does what it's programmed to do, would allow our economy to function much more smoothly. And it can also help and assist with free and fair open elections, ensuring that people have one vote and that their vote actually counts, and it would stop people from voting multiple times. And of course, investing in trading, and then governance, which is very important in terms of tokens and how people decide what a crypto project or token is going to do, how it operates. So now we'll get into what is cryptocurrency. So Satoshi Nakamoto is the creator of Bitcoin, and he said that writing a description for this thing for a general audience is bloody hard. There's nothing to relate it to. And it's absolutely true. We are entering uncharted territories right now. A better definition that I like is cryptocurrencies are digital financial assets for which ownership and transfers of ownership are guaranteed by a cryptographic decentralized technology. So to break that down, digital, essentially not physical, financial assets, you know what those are, and for which the ownership or the transfers of ownership. So it could be the ownership of that token, that coin that you have, or of other types of property within the blockchain, within the layers of the apps, which we'll be talking about shortly. And then they're guaranteed by a cryptographic decentralized technology. Cryptographic is part of the technology that, or cryptography is part of what goes into the blockchain that allows it to be secure. And it's also the work that verifies the blocks that are on the blockchain through the mathematical equations that the computer solve. So we'll talk about consensus mechanisms because this is very important. A lot of folks wonder how are decisions made. You might have heard of like mining and staking and things like that. So the two main consensus mechanisms are proof of work and proof of stake. So proof of work is probably what most people are familiar with. That's like Bitcoin mining, where you're actually doing the work. You have a computer and it's working to solve these complex mathematical equations. And then the first person that solves it correctly gets a reward. They get a piece of the blockchain, meaning that their computer has just created that block of data, and they get Bitcoin in return as a reward for using their computing power to maintain the system. Whereas proof of stake works more as you get to have ownership of the blockchain based on how much of a stake you have. So if someone mines Bitcoin, the Bitcoin is the reward that they get. And that block allows the person who has it, that is ownership of the blockchain. So Ethereum is a bit easier to understand. And that's because Ether, which is the coin on the Ethereum network, that represents ownership stake of the network. But on top of that network, there are all kinds of apps that get built onto it, just like the apps on our cell phones. In order to access those apps, we have to have a phone that is using some underlying network in order for us to access the app store that has those apps. So people make judgments about which network is likely to win, whether it's going to be proof of stake or proof of work, and they start investing in it. They start placing bets on who they think the winner is going to be. Just the same way someone might invest in Google because they think that they're going to create something that's going to continue scaling the internet. So proof of stake allows you to vote on what happens in the future. And the decisions that are made with decentralized finance are made by investors. They're not made by corporations like they are on the main internet. So there is a difference between coins and tokens. A coin is essentially a digital currency that has its own blockchain and it works on its own blockchain. Whereas a token does not have a blockchain and it doesn't necessarily have to operate on its own. Or it doesn't necessarily have to have its own blockchain rather. So Bitcoin and Ethereum are coins because they have their own blockchains. Whereas other types of tokens like Uniswap and such, they don't have their own blockchain, but they work off of either Bitcoin's blockchain or Ethereum's blockchain. You might hear something called an ERC20 token, and that's a token that works on the Ethereum chain. Here are some examples of coins and tokens. So like I mentioned earlier, Bitcoin and Ethereum are coins, as well as Ripple, Litecoin, Cardano, and IOTA, whereas tokens operate on these different coins blockchains like Tron, VeChain, and Augur. So now we'll be talking a little bit about monetary policy. So there are two different types of assets. One's called a stable coin and one is a CBDC, also known as a central bank digital currency. So stable coins are privately issued. The point of a stable coin is, with all the volatility that is happening in crypto, a lot of folks might feel unsafe. So for example, say you invested in Bitcoin and now it just shot up and you have $50,000, but it could drop to 30,000 tomorrow. So how do you keep your value without cashing out to a US dollar or to fiat? Because when you do that, you're creating a taxable event, and that's when they're going to tax you and take your money. So you can buy into a stable coin, which the value stays at $1 and it's based off the US dollar. So you can sell your Bitcoin for something like USDC or USDT. Those are stable coins based off the US dollar. They're pegged at $1.99. And you can essentially sell your $50,000 worth of Bitcoin into a stable coin, and then it's nice and solid. Bitcoin could crash tomorrow and you still have your 50,000 and you don't have to worry about it. So, and then they could be backed by fiat or commodities or crypto. There's some stable coins that are backed by gold, others are backed by other crypto coins or tokens. And stable coins are fully operational right now. They're working as we speak. With CBDCs, these are government issued. These are more conceptual in practice, but they will be something that we're dealing with. The Federal Reserve right now is researching and studying the very likely possibility that we're going to have a digital US dollar, which will be owned and maintained by the Federal Reserve. This is private. It's private as in by the state. This is owned by the state. It's a monopoly of the currency, just like a regular US dollar would be. So when we're comparing gold and Bitcoin, for example, and going through the classifications of money, you can see that with scarcity, we don't really know how much gold is on Earth right now, and we don't really know how much there will be in the future. Whereas with Bitcoin, there's 21 million coins, and there will always be 21 million coins. And once the 21 million coins are distributed, that's it. That's gone. So you're going to have to find someone who has Bitcoin if you want it. As for divisibility, gold, you have to melt or smelt it down, which is expensive. It requires special equipment. Whereas Bitcoin, like I mentioned earlier, one Bitcoin is equal to 100 million Satoshis. So you can break it down quite broadly. As for portability, gold, you can only transfer it in small sizes because it's heavy and it's weighted. Whereas with Bitcoin, you don't even have to have your wallet on you. As long as you have your cell phone or computer with internet access, you can access your money and send it, receive it anywhere in the world. And durability, gold is compromised through time and use. While Bitcoin can be prone to physical harm in terms of the wallet that you have that say it snaps or breaks, but as long as you have your phrases, your private key, you can just buy another wallet, hook it up, and have access again. And as for recognizability, gold requires special equipment and experts to test if it's real gold and the value and the purity. Whereas with Bitcoin, it's verifiable on the blockchain, so no trust is necessary. The blockchain will tell you if it's a real block or not. But cryptocurrency can be seen as more ethical because it's decentralized, it's borderless, it's open source, meaning anyone can use it. What's really important to understand is being public, neutral, and censorship resistant. At any time, the US government could freeze our bank accounts, just the same way that we freeze assets of foreign leaders or what have you, sanctions. So with cryptocurrency or blockchain currencies, no one can really shut you down. No government can shut it down. No corporation can shut it down. So that's actually very useful for, say, activists in foreign countries where press freedoms might be suppressed or limited and people need to get money somehow. This is an easy workaround where they can do this safely. So now it's important to look at Web3 and where that plays into where we're going on the internet. So as the internet has continued to evolve, it's important for us to have an equal playing field in terms of the understanding for how this works. So Web 1 was the initial conception of the internet. Essentially, it was read-only, meaning that if I went to AOL.com and you went to AOL.com, we were going to see the exact same material, the exact same content. Nothing would be different at all. It's just like a news magazine. You buy a magazine and someone else buys the same magazine. It's the same content. It's just on a computer. Whereas Web 2, that started playing more into the late 90s and the early to mid 2000s, we saw blogs and social media. So now, not only could you read, but you could also write your own content. And this is where things took a turn for the worse, I'd say, where centralization occurred because that internet activity was being monetized by small groups like Google, Apple, Facebook, through advertisements, cookies, data mining, tracking, selling information in our personal data without our consent. So the next stage of evolution is Web 3, and this is the ownership economy where you can read, write, and own the content that you have, meaning that if your information is on the blockchain or what have you, well, it doesn't even necessarily have to be on the blockchain. You can consent to remove your information. Just say you were to give your information to a store to get coupons or what have you, and then they're sending you too much. So now you can say, hey, you can't have my information anymore, and then they stop sending you stuff. So in the general internet, there are basic layers. So what we're familiar with, like right now, this lecture is on Zoom. It's on the surface web. The surface web, which is what we can get on Google Chrome, Microsoft Explorer, Microsoft Edge. It's only 4% of the internet that we're able to access. The other 96% is backed up by cryptography, which is part of the blockchain. You have the deep web, which involves databases that are very secure. They use high-level encryption. It could be for medical records. This university most likely has databases that keep all of our information secure. And then under the deep web, you have the dark web, which requires specific browsers like Tor to access. If you went to a Tor URL on Google Chrome, nothing's going to pop up. It's going to say this page doesn't exist. You need a special browser in order to access the dark web that you can't see. So just like there are layers within the internet, there are layers within DeFi as well. So the applications, you have like a lot of those dApps that we talked about before, as well as the protocol layers, which that's actually how the chain itself is created and managed, and also determines whether the chain is permissioned or permissionless. Then the network, of course, is how the computers communicate and interact with each other. And then the infrastructure layer is the mining or the creation of tokens in that manner. So when we look at centralized finance versus DeFi, centralized finance is what we typically think of, brick and mortar banks, traditional institutions, investment and hedge funds. So examples of CeFi within crypto are Coinbase, Robinhood, and Binance. Whereas decentralized finance is an emerging financial technology that's working towards building a new internet financial system. And that's where blockchain replaces traditional intermediaries and trust mechanisms that are associated with CeFi. So here you can see that on the left are lots of brands and apps that we're already familiar with in the centralized world, but on the right side, you could see their decentralized equivalents. So there's already competitors using the same use cases that we have now, but in a decentralized manner. So smart contracts are very important in this regard, and that this smart contracts can play a very large role in how we make decisions. So for example, smart contracts work in this fashion. If this happens, then this will happen. So if A and B occur, then C will happen. So say you're trying, Bob wants to sell his house and John wants to buy a house. So you need a buyer and a seller. So they come together, now they've been matched. The smart contract says that in order to get the house, you need to receive money as payment. So once it's received as the payment, it then distributes the money over to the seller, and then the blockchain just confirms it. And then there's undisputed ownership. You don't have to go through a real estate agent. You don't need an intermediary. So you can go to your neighbor and buy a house, buy a car, just like that. And this also helps too with having more fair judicial system that eliminates human error, human bias, where people might get sentenced because of the color of their skin or for many other reasons. Where we have a smart contract that says, okay, if you committed this crime and these variables fit, then you get this sentence. We can take a look at peer-to-peer. On the left, we have centralized computer systems, which is what we have now, whereas peer-to-peer is all of our computers are intertwined and interacting with each other. So there is a potential for market disruption through peer-to-peer. If you might recall Napster back in the 90s and early 2000s, where people were able to download a bunch of music for free. This really hurt the music industry. They went nuts over it. If you see at the top of Napster, they never really recovered. So, and that was because, the centralized music industry is forcing us to pay 99 cents per song or what have you. So they realized that they could, because people wanted unlimited music, they can move to a streaming model where they can charge you a certain amount, and then you could have access to unlimited music. The reason we have streaming is because of Napster, is because of peer-to-peer, because it was that type of thinking that it radicalized and disrupted the market, and we see those effects today. So if it can happen for this, it's possible to use it against larger other types of corporations as well. So very quickly, we'll go into the actual policy implications. So this is how you write bad policy. The infrastructure bill was 2,700 pages long. No one ever talked about cryptocurrency. It was about roads and bridges and ports and what have you, infrastructure, internet. Someone shoehorned this paragraph. That whole paragraph has no punctuation. It's one run-on sentence. That's how you write bad policy. Someone shoehorned this in. This is what I read at the bar that made my heart sing. It essentially says that any broker, a broker is the person who buys or sells cryptocurrency, that they can be taxed, and it is taxed in certain ways. It didn't define what a broker was. So a broker under this language could be anyone. It could be you, me, whether we actually have an exchange or not. It could be software developers. It could be nodes. You could sue a computer if you wanted to, tax a computer. It was very unfair, and it's just bad policy. You have, especially with something new like this, you have to have proper definitions and have an understanding of the terms of what you're dealing with. So part of my work has extended to with the Congressional Blockchain Caucus, which is a bipartisan group within the US House. So it has about 30 members, and they essentially share my view and vision in that cryptocurrency and blockchain technology ought to develop the way that the internet did, which is with minimal regulation and in a way that seeks to protect consumers as well. So right now, these are some current pieces of legislation and policies that are in the pipeline right now. House Resolution 6006 is Keeping Innovation in America Act. This bill actually counters that policy that we talked about. So when I was lobbying initially, that's what we were trying to stop and prevent. It was like, we can't have this pass. We need something that's going to overtake this. So this is a direct response to that. Whereas you also have House Resolution 5496, that's a Clarity for Digital Tokens Act that allows crypto projects to develop for 2 years without government regulation or intervention. And then within those 2 years, they have to prove that they're not a security. Otherwise, they're going to be mandated by the SEC. We have decentralized autonomous organizations, also known as DAOs. That's essentially a project in which all the investors have equal ownership of what's going on. Everyone has 1 vote per person, and that's how they decide what happens on a network, what happens on a project. It's not based on, oh, I have 100 million coins and you have 10 coins, so I have 100 million votes and you have 10 votes. It's whether I have 100 million or 10, 1 vote, 1 vote, 1 vote, 1 vote. And things are able to be much more democratic that way. And then President Biden, after the pushback he got from the infrastructure bill, he sent out an executive order, which essentially aims to protect consumers. It's directing different government regulatory agencies to actually do research and study, do their proper due diligence to make sure that we're not making hasty decisions like that policy I showed you earlier. Another issue with cryptocurrency is the environmental implications and sustainability. I'm very big on the environment. I'm a big green person. Bitcoin is like the granddaddy of technology. It's old. It wasn't meant to be energy efficient, and that's why we need to move away from it. Bitcoin uses 1,173 kilowatt hours per transaction. Per transaction, that is more energy. That is about the same energy that a typical American household uses in 6 weeks, which is ridiculous. Whereas Visa is much smaller than that. It's 0.001 kilowatt hours per transaction. But then you have a crypto token or a coin like Stellar, which is 0.0002 kilowatt hours, meaning that this token, this coin has less energy usage than a Visa transaction. So it certainly is possible we can create coins and tokens that are energy efficient. That's the way that they're programmed to be. There's also the use of energy, renewable energy sources. El Salvador just recently made Bitcoin legal tender, and they are using their geothermal energy from their volcanoes to process their mining power. And you can also use hydroelectric dams, wind energy, solar farms, and that allows us to be more environmentally sustainable and conscious. And when we talk about crypto, we hear, crypto is a scam, crypto is fake, you're just going to lose your money. Well, there are ways that we can make this ecosystem safer for consumers, the same way that we built layers to improve the internet and make the internet safer. So the first, if you wanted to stop people, or like, how could you protect people from, cryptocurrency scam? Well, the first thing we could do is just prevent as many people from accessing the technology. That could be like some assets can only be purchased by accredited investors. Those are rich folks. So only rich people can continue getting rich. We wouldn't be allowed to invest in it. Or you could make a safer way that ensures, the creation of mutual funds, ETFs, essentially diversification. Here in the US, we don't allow diversification mixing stocks with crypto. Like if it's not very commonplace here, and other countries like Canada, Germany, and Singapore are doing that right now. So we're way behind the curve. because diversification is a great way to make investing easier and also encourages participation. Another important part is improving financial literacy. Lots of folks don't know what crypto is, and even taking a step back, they don't even know what finance is or how to invest or how to read a chart properly. So it's important that we teach people how to be financially literate. And it's also important to create useful and helpful platforms that easily onboard and give you the guides that you need to make safe and sound financial decisions. There's also 24/7 risk monitoring engines that some platforms use to ensure that scams and fraud aren't happening. And we see news of like crypto exchanges being hit or attacked and funds being stolen. It's been discussed within the government of creating some sort of FDIC system. It might even be regulated by the FDIC, where cryptocurrency could be insured up to certain amounts in the event that there's a scam or a hack or an exchange crashes, where you won't lose your money, it will be insured just like a typical bank account. And those are, yeah, so crypto regulations, we already have the framework necessary to solve a lot of these problems. Lots of folks have said, let's create a new agency to regulate crypto. It's like crypto lending platforms can be regulated by the FDIC, and trading platforms can be managed by the SEC or CFTC. So it's like we have the tools already here. And what's interesting is people seem to be scared of new technologies. When banks moved off pen and paper and started using computers for transactions, they started getting sued because people are like, no, you can't do this. Right now, my money information is just floating in the ether somewhere. In the same way with email, the American Bar Association sent a letter saying lawyers cannot use email. It's a threat to attorney-client privilege. Because again, the information is just floating everywhere. Who's going to see it? Whatever. So it's like, this seems really ridiculous today. And I feel that the same fears that we have in crypto are the same in 20 years from now. We're going to be like, duh. So where we go from here, we're wrapping it up now very quickly. Remittances are very, very important. People often have to pay predatory fees when sending money to loved ones abroad. And these predatory fees often target migrants and some of the world's most vulnerable people. These remittance systems through crypto are open to anyone. There are no intermediaries, no fees. So, and in many cases, these remittance transactions cost less than a penny. And they're pretty much instant. They can happen in less than an hour, whereas you have to jump through almost a week worth of hurdles in the traditional remittance payments. Universal basic income is also something that can be used with cryptocurrency. Like, say the government does create a digital dollar, they could allow all Americans to have a digital wallet. You could get your tax returns that way. You know, instead of getting it sent to a bank account, you can get it in crypto. And hopefully one day, you know, we can have a system that's strong enough where we can provide universal basic income to, if not everyone, to people that truly do need it and can benefit. And then there's also housing distribution, which I think is really cool. So how this would work is we already have like community land trusts right now, which are typically public-private partnerships. And that essentially means that you're dependent on private money. So if you wanted to keep it kosher and keep it completely public, yeah, you know, you could have community groups that come together and they invest and create a fund. And now they create a token system which can be used to distribute housing. So for example, you can create a red token, which is for single people, no kids. You can create a blue token for couples with no kids. And then you create a green token for families with families, couples with kids. So say you're single and you have your token. Now you can look at all of the houses that are available for that type of token. And if you like it, okay, here's my token, smart contract, it's yours. And if you don't want the house anymore, you just exchange it and get your token back. So this would be a great way for the state and government and even community public organizations to distribute housing. And finally, workplace democratization in DAOs. So, the workplace is one of the least democratic places that we have, and that's where most adults spend their time. When you create a DAO, like I mentioned earlier, everyone gets a fair vote. So this could actually be seen as a version of an online worker co-op, where all of the workers own collectively, and they decide democratically on how decisions are made, what products are made, who gets paid what. They get to make that themselves, and it's not dependent on a board of 5 people. This is the end of my presentation. I thank all of you for taking the time to be here. This is the website for my firm if you'd like to check it out, and my email is at the bottom. I also have business cards if you'd like to keep in touch. I love talking to people about this, and lots of folks like getting involved in different ways. So yes, thank you so much for your time. I truly appreciate it, and I hope you learned something.
Or two. We could do one.
Thank you so much, Joshua. That was such an interesting presentation. It's really amazing to see how expensive cryptocurrency is and how it can be just used for almost anything, including housing. So that's amazing. Thank you. Now we have time for audience Q&A. Audience members, and please raise your hand if you have a question. We have 2 questions. We have time for a couple questions. Go ahead, Kelly.
For someone who's interested in joining digital finance, how did they start?
So to clarify, when you say getting involved in digital finance, do you mean like investing or coding or?
I guess like the general aspect of digital finance, like if you're unfamiliar with it.
Sure. The most important thing is education and making sure that we're financially literate somehow. On YouTube, there's a channel called Crypto Cases. She has awesome videos. She breaks things down well. She breaks down the technical aspects, even policy aspects, talks about why market behaviors act the way that they do. But yeah, I think the most important part is learning more about finance and how the finance system works, because even though crypto is separating itself from centralized finance, they similarly work together, which is why you have people who are very well versed in stocks and traditional investments. They get into crypto because it kind of works the same. The education is the big thing, and reaching out to people who are in similar industries.
So I have a quick question. So you say, I just want to get your opinion. So do you believe that this new form of currency, like cryptocurrency, is just as reliable, if not more reliable than old forms of currency? Because it was, since from what it sounds like to me, it's less regulated than the older forms of currency. And you were saying that you wanted it to, or you believe it should develop how the internet should, but then now the internet is more regulated because when it was unregulated before, they were able to get away with things like selling our information, or, for example, it's just saying hate crime speech on Facebook.
Sure.
So do you see it still as more reliable?
I believe that it's more reliable, but talking about regulation, there are already many crypto currencies that are regulated. Those are the ones that are centralized, like stable coins, for example. Those are regulated by, they can be regulated by the government. And also, if a token can't classify itself as a commodity within 2 years, they're going to be regulated as a security. So that means that they're going to go through the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. So when I was speaking earlier about wanting cryptocurrency to evolve with the internet did, what I meant was the stance of the crypto industry, and me particularly the decentralized finance industry, is if the government wants to regulate this, we want it done our way, meaning We don't want banks getting their nose in this because they laughed it off and they're just going to use it to their advantage. Like, we don't want you involved and we want you to actually listen to us. So Congress, the U.S. House Financial Services Committee has already had meetings directly addressing crypto and only crypto and digital assets. So the government is, government's slow, it's not known for its speed, but they're slowly but surely getting educated and learning how this works. Yeah, of course, thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us here today. We're going to conclude our event, but thank you so much to Joshua for sharing your important work and joining us today. You know, educating us about cryptocurrency is a very confusing topic, so thank you for breaking it down for us.
My pleasure, thank you. For having me. Thank you.
Having Kim Sarukari on May 16th related to health policy, so please come out to the next seminar. And for you all to learn more about our upcoming events and the School of Public Policy, you can visit our website at spp.ucr.edu. Thank you all.